Hi everyone, I hope this finds you well. In this lesson we're going to be talking about granular synthesis. So we're going to start out by just going over kind of a definition of what granular synthesis is. We'll talk about the history of granular synthesis, look at some early works that use it, go over some parameters in a little bit more detail, and then we'll look at how to do granular synthesis in two different programs. We'll look at SoundGrain, a standalone granular synthesis application, and then we'll look at how to do this in VCV Rack with Mutable Instruments clouds. So before we dive into granular synthesis, let's get a larger big picture of sound synthesis, because this is something we're going to do this week, is look at a few different types of synthesis. So as we talked about in the very beginning of the semester, sound synthesis is the technique of generating and manipulating sound, usually through electronic means. And there's all sorts of different types of sound synthesis. I've listed a few of the most popular ones on the slide here. And some of these should sound and look familiar. The top two are the ones that we've spent most of the semester on, East Coast and West Coast synthesis, or subtractive synthesis. And West Coast, you can't really sum up in a single word, but wave shaping is a big part of that. Later this week, we're going to talk about additive synthesis and FM synthesis. Additive is kind of the opposite of subtractive synthesis, where you're starting with simple waves like sine waves and then building them on top of each other to make more complex sounds. And then FM synthesis is a kind of synthesis that's actually based in the technique of frequency modulation. And then granular synthesis and physical modeling are two types of synthesis that you generally need digital equipment to do. You can do some aspects of this with analog equipment, but both are generally done with digital devices. Granular synthesis we'll talk about in detail today. Physical modeling has to do with creating complex algorithms that imitate acoustic instruments, like the way that strings behave or the way that air operates when it's moving through a column, like in an organ or a wind instrument or things like that. So physical modeling actually looks at the very specific physical behavior of objects like strings or metal objects being struck and things like that, and is able to actually create variations. So you can do really interesting things in physical modeling, like create the sound of a glass string being plucked underwater or something like that. Or you can take the way that physical things behave, but then expand that into different dimensions that may not exist in the actual physical world. And then the last two, vector synthesis and wavetable synthesis, both have to do with moving through different waveform shapes. Vector has to do with like crossfading between different waveforms using like a joystick that moves between a few different points, where one point might be a sawtooth wave, one point might be a triangle wave, and one point might be a sine wave. And you're kind of just moving the joystick and kind of mixing through them in two dimensions. Wavetable synthesis is kind of the same thing, except imagine if you had a lot more than just 4 different points moving a joystick through, but you've got like a whole different table of all kinds of different wave shapes, and you can kind of move through them as you like. This is what some popular digital synthesizers like Serum use. So these are all these different types of sound synthesis, and they're not all distinct things that you like have to do in isolation, but you can actually mix and match these, especially in modular synthesis. And so we'll look in VCV Rack at different modules that do some of these different types of synthesis, and then you can mix and match them and combine them. So as I said, we'll focus on granular synthesis today. So granular synthesis kind of blurs the distinction between a kind of synthesis where we're building sounds from scratch, or a kind of sound manipulation where we're taking a sound that already exists and modifying it in some way. And that's because in granular synthesis, we generally start with a pre-recorded sound file. Sometimes we'll work with simple waveforms, like starting with a sine wave or something like that, but most often people are taking a pre-recorded sound file and then manipulating it through granular synthesis. So the way that this works is we take a sample, like a recording of, say, a baby crying, and then we cut that sample into very, very short slices, and we call these slices grains. And these grains might last anywhere from, say, 1 millisecond to 100 milliseconds. And even in some granulators, you can have grains as long as 300 or 500 milliseconds. So we cut these samples down into these very, very short grains. And then we can use these grains to build new sounds effectively. And we can kind of treat these grains in different ways. So there's a few different parameters that we're working with when we're working with granular synthesis, but the main thing to think about is that there's really 2 levels. There's the level of the grain itself, the individual grain of sound, and then there's parameters relating to the larger texture. So with regard to the individual grains, we can alter the duration of the grain, like we already talked about. Is it 1 millisecond long? Is it 20 milliseconds, 70 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds long? We can look at the envelope of the grain, how it gradually fades in and fades out. It's like any other sound, it's going to have a shape to it. And we can actually transpose individual grains to different pitch levels. So then we perform these operations on individual grains, and then when we take all these grains together into a larger texture, we can alter parameters with regard to that texture. And the most important of these is probably density. So density has to do with, okay, how many grains are we hearing per second? Are we hearing just one grain per second? Or are we hearing a whole mass of grains, almost like we're pouring sand out onto a table, and every time this grain of sand hits the table, we hear a sound? That would be a much larger, much denser, massive sound. We can also think about the rhythm of the texture. Are we hearing these grains one at a time in a steady rhythm? Or is it, again, like the example of pouring sand onto a table? Even if we're pouring at a relatively steady rate, the moment that these grains hit the table is going to be a little bit random. And we're pulling all these grains from a fixed sample of sound usually. So like this recording of the baby crying. And so then we can think about, okay, well, where are these grains coming from as we move through the sample? We can think about the direction that we're moving through the sample. Are we moving through the sample from beginning to end, or are we moving in reverse? And then we can think about the speed that we're moving through the sample. Are we moving through the sample at its regular speed? Let's say the sample takes 3 seconds to move through. Are we moving through from beginning to end in 3 seconds, or are we moving through much faster or much slower than that? Or we don't even have to necessarily move through in a linear way at all. It's almost like we take all the grains of the sound and put them in a jar and then shake that jar up and then pour it out on the table. We might hear those in a totally random order. So let me give you some examples with this baby crying. First, I'm going to play the baby crying once again, and I want you to pay attention to the shape of the sound. At the beginning of the sound, the baby is kind of screaming, so the sound is kind of noisy and inharmonic. And then towards the end of the gesture, the baby kind of calms down and we hear an actual harmonic sound. The baby's just voice kind of bending up and down in pitch. So it moves from a noisy sound to a pitched sound. Okay, and now I'm going to use granular synthesis to slow that sound down without changing its pitch. Now I'm going to do the same thing, where I'm going to move through the sound from beginning to end slowly, but I'm going to gradually change the pitch of each grain so that we're starting with the sound pitched very, very low, and then it's going to get pitched higher and higher and higher as we move through the sample. Now I'm going to just randomly shuffle all the grains in the sound. And so rather than moving through the sample from beginning to end, we're just going to hear random grains from all throughout the sample. Now I'll do the same thing, pulling random grains from different part of the sample, but I'm also going to randomize the pitch. So we're going to hear random grains at random pitch levels. And now for a last example, I'm going to move backwards through the sound. So starting with the harmonic part and then moving towards the noisy part. But we're going to be moving through slower. And we're also going to have a little bit of randomness. So we'll still be able to hear that we're moving from the end to the beginning, but it's not going to be perfectly linear. It'll be like moving in these kind of random clusters. All right, so let's talk about the history of granular synthesis a little bit. The development is often attributed to a Greek composer named Ioannis Xenakis, who did a lot of work with granular synthesis. There are other composers, one of whom we'll talk about in a sec, who was doing similar things in a different part of the world around the same time and even a little bit earlier. Xenakis was a really important figure in contemporary music. He was a composer, also an architect and an engineer, pioneered a lot of electroacoustic techniques, and did a lot of things with algorithmic composition and applying mathematical models to the composition of music. So an important piece of his with regard to granular synthesis is a piece that some of you guys in DMP 350 already know, which is called Concrete pH. And in this piece, he took a recording of burning wood embers, recorded that sound onto tape, cut the tape into fragments that lasted just 1 second, and then kind of shuffled them, reorganized them. So he takes a sound which is kind of grainy on its own. These burning wood embers are just these little pops, these little sparks of sound, cuts them into 1 second fragments, so he kind of granulizes them already. And then he changes the speed of the tape to alter the pitch, and then uses mixing to change the density of the texture. And that actually becomes the main variable factor in the piece. The piece is not really about melody changes or rhythms of the grains. All throughout the piece, we basically have this cloud of grains, but what changes over the piece is the density. We have some sections which are relatively sparse, and we can actually pick out individual grains. Then there are other parts where it gets really, really dense, and it's hard to differentiate between them. So as I said, Xenakis wrote and theorized a lot about granular synthesis, and he actually has a really well-known book called Formalized Music, in which he writes a lot about applying mathematical models to music. And there's an excerpt from early in the book where he talks about this idea that all sound consists of these smaller units, these little microquanta. So he says, quote, "All sound is an integration of grains, of elementary sonic particles, of sonic quanta. Each of these elementary grains has a threefold nature: duration, frequency, and intensity. All sound, even all continuous sonic variation, is conceived as an assemblage of a large number of elementary grains adequately disposed in time. A complex sound may be imagined as a multicolored firework in which each point of light appears and instantaneously disappears against a black sky. But in this firework, there would be such a quantity of points of light organized in such a way that their rapid and teeming succession would create forms and spirals, slowly unfolding, or conversely, brief explosions setting the whole sky aflame. A line of light would be created by a sufficiently large multitude of points appearing and disappearing instantaneously." So he's basically talking about this idea that things that look like they're static, like there are these whole composite things, actually consist of all these little individual points. So this is a really eloquent explication of some of the ideas underlying granular synthesis. So there's a couple other pieces which I don't want to go into in too much detail, but I'll just mention them quickly, and I'll post these in the supplemental folder on Blackboard. The first is Hugh LeCain's Dripsody. Hugh LeCain was a Canadian electroacoustic pioneer and also developed a lot of early synthesizers and just built a lot of really early electronic instruments. And his piece Dripsody is a really short piece. It's only 90 seconds long, but it's an entire piece built from a recording of a single drop of water. So this is super cool. He takes just a recording of a single drop, and unlike in Xenakis' piece where he takes a larger recording and then granulates it, chops it up into little tiny parts, and then makes something new out of that, Hugh LeCain is actually effectively starting with a grain. He's starting with a single individual tiny sound, and then he builds this larger piece from it. So then it's not until the 1980s that we get a piece created with a real-time digital granular synthesizer with a computer application that actually performs granular synthesis in real time. And that's Barry Truax's piece Riverrun. So in Riverrun, Truax creates these dense clouds of sound that shift parameters over time according to ramps. By ramps, I mean these linear trajectories that move through the piece. On the slide is a spectrogram of Riverrun. It's a long piece, it's about 20 minutes long or so, and it divides into 5 sections. And in 2 of these 5 sections, the outer 2, you can see these really clean linear trajectories. There are these frequency bands of grains that slide up and down over time. This takes a long time to hear, so you don't necessarily hear these glissandi unless you listen with a lot of focus, because it takes a long time for these trajectories to unfold. But nonetheless, they're there. And even in the middle sections, you can see, like in that second section, how he starts from a relatively narrow density and then gets a much more dense sound and then moves back. Same thing in the third section. And it's kind of neat to pair this with Dripsody because both of these pieces rely on this metaphor of water. In LeCain's piece, he's actually using recorded water sounds. In Truax's piece, he's doing granulation with sine waves, but he has this metaphor of water underlying it, this idea of accumulating drops, forming a river, and then moving towards the larger ocean. All right, so let's talk in a little more detail about some specific parameters relating to granular synthesis. So the first one we'll talk about are grain envelopes. So when we're dividing a sound into all these grains, we're not just actually haphazardly like cutting a sound into little pieces. We have to do a little bit more than that. In fact, each grain needs to have a particular envelope in order to avoid the harsh clicks as waveforms are interrupted. If we just were to break a sound randomly at any given point, there's a high likelihood that we break it in the middle of a wave cycle. And if we do that, we can get a sharp jump. And you guys know waveforms with sharp jumps produce a lot of harmonics, and very often that just sounds like a big noisy click. And if we have tons of grains per second, we might end up with 2 loud clicks for every grain, one at the beginning and one at the end, and that would just be a mess of noise. So we have to kind of window each grain. We have to give it an envelope shape. And the envelope of a grain can have a really large impact on the sound of the overall texture. So most granular synthesizers use these bell-shaped envelopes that are sometimes called Hahn windows because they're based on the Hahn function. Hahn was a Austrian meteorologist who came up with this function that we use a lot in digital signal processing. So on the bottom left there, you see a Hahn window. It looks like a bell curve or something. So that's a really common envelope shape where you have a nice smooth attack and smooth release. It almost seems like a sine wave kind of shape. But sometimes you'll see triangular envelopes with a linear attack and release, or trapezoidal envelopes, almost like an AHD envelope. So different granular synthesizers will allow you to change these envelopes, and you can explore some of the different ways this impacts the sound of the overall texture. Another thing to think about is grain spacing. And grain spacing is really important because it impacts the sound of the overall texture. And there's 2 types of grain spacing. One is synchronous and the other is asynchronous. And these are so different that sometimes they're even categorized as whole different types of granular synthesis. So in synchronous granular synthesis, the grains are equally spaced. This is what you see on the bottom right of the slide there. And so if each grain is equally spaced, we get these regular patterns in how the grains appear. And at low speeds, at low grain density, this creates these regular rhythms. But as we increase the speed and increase the density of the grains, this can lead to the granulator actually producing new frequencies. So if you think about it, if we have all these grains and they all have the same envelope, and we have, say, 60 of those grains every second, one after another, synchronously spaced, equally spaced, well, that's effectively just like drawing a waveform. And we have 60 of those per second. That means 60 wave cycles per second. We're just going to hear a 60 hertz low tone. If we have 100 grains per second, we're going to hear a 100 hertz tone. So in synchronous granular synthesis, we can actually produce new pitches that weren't in the original sound. And this could be something that's welcome or unwelcome depending on how you're working. The alternative to this is asynchronous granular synthesis, where the grains are scattered kind of randomly in time. So there's a little bit of randomness involved. And so at low speeds and density, it'll create these kind of disjunct, irregular rhythms. And then at high speeds and high density, you won't be producing new frequencies because there's not that repetition, there's not that periodicity. You're not going to produce frequencies. You might get a noisier, richer texture, but you'll at least avoid producing sustained tones. So the last thing that we'll point out here is the way that time in granular synthesis can be manipulated. So there's all sorts of different interesting temporal effects having to do with time that we can accomplish when we're working in granular synthesis. The first is that we can change the speed of the sound without changing its pitch. So in tape music, these are kind of tied together. If a sound is sped up, you're going to be changing the time of the piece, the tempo of the sound, and you're also going to be pitching it up. But in granular synthesis, we can actually decouple these. So we can do something like repeating or skipping grains as we move through the sound to make the sound move faster or slower without changing its pitch. So on the bottom of the slide there, I have this long row of little diamonds that we can say represent individual grains. And I have a little orange window around a group of grains. And imagine that as we move through the sound, this orange box, this orange window just kind of moves from left to right, kind of highlighting a section of different grains. And you can imagine as this box scrolls from left to right that we're kind of just cycling through the grains in that box, maybe linearly in order, or maybe just kind of randomly shuffling through them. And so if that box moves from beginning to end really quickly, then we might hear each grain of the sound just once. If the box moves really slowly, we might hear each grain several times, and therefore it would take us longer to move through the sound, but because each grain is still played at its original pitch, we're not actually changing the overall pitch of the sound. And we can do the same thing in the opposite way by changing the pitch without changing the speed. So we can play these grains at faster and slower frequencies as we're repeating them. That's going to change the pitch, or we can also change the pitch of individual grains and just kind of pitch all the grains up, but still move through them one at a time. Another really interesting aspect of granular synthesis is the idea of freezing sounds. So if you imagine you're watching a YouTube video, say you're watching a video of a cat jumping from one piece of furniture to the next, and you pause it while the cat is kind of leaping in midair. As you pause the video, the cat is kind of frozen there in midair. And it's almost like you've frozen this moment of time. But the way that sound works in playback devices, if you were to hit the pause button on a sound, usually the sound stops. It's not like the sound freezes in time in the same way the visuals do. But in granular synthesis, we can actually do just that. We can have a sound that normally is moving from one place to another from beginning to end, and actually freeze it in place and almost seem like we are freezing the sound, pausing the sound, and letting it continue ringing out. And this is a really simple thing to do. We just imagine as we're moving from left to right, that orange box is moving through the grains. Imagine if we just stopped in the middle. And then instead of moving from left to right, we just kind of randomly cycle through a little selection of grains in the middle. So then we're constantly cycling through a small selection of grains, and that's going to produce the effect of the sound kind of being frozen in time. And we'll look at some example of all of these when we start working in SoundGrain. And so let's actually go ahead and do that now. So we're going to be working with SoundGrain. I think you guys have all downloaded it already. SoundGrain is an open source granular synthesis software. It's free to use, and the source code is available online, so you can see how they programmed it. I believe they programmed it in Python. So here we are in SoundGrain. I've just opened the program up, and the first thing I'm going to do is just grab a sound file from my desktop and drag it into the program here. And before I start playing anything, I'm going to check my audio drivers. So I'm going to go up to the top where it says audio drivers and choose whichever output I want to use. For me, it's going to be Soundflower for right now. For you, it would be whatever you want to use. So the way that SoundGrain works is it relies on these trajectories that we draw through the waveform. You can see here I've got the waveform of my sound as my main area here. And then I'm going to go up to where it says trajectories in the top right. And I'm going to draw some lines. And I'm going to start by just drawing a straight line as straight as I can across the top. And now when I go down here and press start, you can hear that this is the baby crying, and it's moving through this sound from beginning to end. And it's moving a little slower than normal, but if I go over here to playback, there's this timer speed, and this timer speed is going to affect how quickly that cursor moves. And so if I increase this timer speed, it actually goes even slower. And if I decrease it, it moves faster and faster. Right below it, there's this points per step. And what this is going to do is affect how many points, effectively how many pixels are there in every step of this cursor. So if I slow this down, but then I increase the points per step, you'll see it'll hop along a little faster. Basically because instead of going one pixel at a time, it's jumping through. So you can finesse the timer speed and the points per step, and that'll allow you to really have a lot of control over the speed that you're moving through your sound file. Another important thing to realize is that this main screen here, you can use the x-axis to change the pitch. So I can just drag this line that I drew down. And that'll pitch the sound up and down. Now, I drew this line from left to right, and so my cursor moves from left to right, but I could draw another cursor, another trajectory, from right to left. And now I've got two different trajectories. One is moving from left to right at a particular speed, and my second one is moving from right to left, backwards through the sound, at a slower speed, and I can choose my different trajectories and adjust their speeds accordingly. I can delete my trajectories by selecting them and just hitting delete. And I can also draw my lines so they're only going over a certain part of the sound. So I don't even want to mess with the noisy, the screamy part of the sound. I just want to worry about the harmonic sound. I just want to move backwards through the harmonic sound. I can just draw a straight line backwards over this part of the sound. And that's just going to affect that last part of the sound. That's just going to spend its area cycling through the grains in that slower part of the sound. I can also draw my line moving from low to high, something like this. And once I draw a line, I can start to adjust its shape by clicking on it and pulling in different directions. So you don't have to just start with straight lines. You can also draw, the default option is free, which allows you to just draw your own trajectories freely. So you could start in the back up at the regular pitch of the harmonic sound and then steadily move down, and maybe when you get into the noisy area, just kind of go nuts. You can also draw circles, which will just cycle through things in a loop. You can use this blue handle to make them larger and smaller. You can adjust the amplitude of each sound with this little slider. So I've got two trajectories, number 1 and number 2. Number 2 is quite loud, so if I bring it down, I can get them to a more equal amplitude. And the last option they have, they call oscill, which is kind of like a little figure 8 shape. And now I'm going to open up the granulator controls, which I can go by File, Open Granulator Controls, or just go to Command P. And that opens these controls, which are really important. There's a lot of ways that we can really control the sound by using these. And the first one here we have is density of grains per second. It defaults to 32, which honestly is not very many. But we can go even lower than that, and you can hear just right now, we've got 1 grain per second. And as we increase this, you can start to hear that density grow. Now there's 3 grains per second. At around 30, 40, it starts to have this kind of reverby character. And right now these grains are synchronously spaced. So as we get higher and higher, you can actually start to hear these pitches start. Just like we were talking about before. And as I increase the density, the pitch increases. And as I lower the density, the pitch decreases. The next option here is the global transposition. So this is what the global pitch range is going to be in our main window here. And one thing that you can do is bring this all the way up to 2. And then instead of the very top being your baseline pitch, you can actually have the middle be your baseline pitch. And then you can move from lower than your original sound to higher than your original sound. Our next option is grain duration. And so right now our grains are defaulting to 200 milliseconds, which is kind of long. We can make our grains shorter than that by sliding down. So at 5 milliseconds, they're basically like these little clicks. And then we can get it as high as 500. And at 500, they're barely grains. They're more just like little snippets of the sound. Let's go back to around 200. You can double click in there and type in the value you want. So grain start time deviation, this is where we can move from synchronous spacing to asynchronous spacing. So all the way at 0, the grains are synchronously spaced. And as we start to move this to the right, we introduce a little bit of randomness. So right now we have this regular pulse of grains. And as we start to slide this to the right, you can hear a little bit of disjunction introduced into that rhythm. Make our grains a little shorter. And so now if I increase this density, you won't hear those pitches when we get really high up. It's a little noisier and richer, but we don't get those pitches. Because now the grains are more randomly spaced. So then the next 5 options from underneath that are all ways of randomizing parameters that we've already worked with. So this first one here is the grain density randomness, and that's going to introduce some randomness into the amount of density that we have. So right now it's all the way at 1, but as we increase this density, sometimes we might hear just 1 grain per second. Other times we might hear a little more or a little less than that. Let's go ahead and increase this a little bit. You can hear that density kind of ebb and flow. Then we have a pitch randomizer for the grains. So as we increase this, we'll increase the randomness of every individual grain's pitch. It's almost got this chorus-like effect where now we're hearing all these different grains at all these different pitches. Go ahead and bring that pretty close back to the beginning. Also, right now our grains are at 100 milliseconds, 108 specifically, but we can introduce a grain duration random. And so as we slide this over, you'll hear that all the grains are changing their duration. Some are very long and some are very short. So this grains position random is one I like a lot. Right now, the grains are hovering pretty close to this cursor. As the cursor moves across the line, it's pulling grains that are just where that cursor is hovering. But as we increase this grains position random, it's going to pull randomly from different areas around that cursor. And the further we move this slider, the wider the area is that it's pulling random grains from. If we move it all the way to the end, it's pulling random grains from all across the trajectory. And so right now you can hear grains from the beginning and from the end all mixed up together. We can combine that with the pitch random to get some really interesting effects. And the last one has to do with just panning. So which speaker are the grains coming out of? I like to just turn this one all the way up, and then you get full randomness where different grains are coming from all different places in the stereo field. And then over here, we have these two different tabs in the granulator controls. The Y-axis just allows you to change some of the ranges that you're working with these sliders. So that can be a handy place to make some adjustments as well. All right, let's go ahead and set this back to a relatively straightforward setup. Just add a little bit of randomness on each parameter, not too much. So now I'm going to open up the envelope window. So if you go up to File, Open Envelope Window, or Command E, you'll get this little window here. And here we can adjust the envelope of the individual grains. I'm going to go back to a really low density. So right now we've got this nice Han window here. And then I can use these little nodes to give my envelope a quicker attack and release. You'll notice if I go all the way to the edge, I'll start to hear those clicks at the beginning and end. And if we increase our density and do that, the texture will be a little noisier. Or we can have something that fades in and out even more smoothly. You can even draw in your own wave envelopes and come up with something kind of creative. A little bit of a tremolo effect here. So that's something else you guys can explore. And so those are the basic granular synthesis tools we have to work with in SoundGrain, though there's a couple additional features that are kind of interesting to explore. They have this FX ball area where you can add these little balls that as the cursor moves through the ball, it adds some certain effects. So right now I'm going to add a complex resonator ball. You can kind of pull on the ball to stretch them out, make them a little larger. And so now every time the cursor moves through this ball, it's going to move through a resonant filter, and you'll hear a little tone. I can right-click on the ball to open the parameters for that effect, so I can change the resonant frequency here. And then you can just double-click them to make them go away. I could add a reverb ball and stretch it out so that it's as big as the whole screen. And so now whenever the cursor moves through this reverb ball, the sound will have reverb added to it. And I can adjust some of the reverb controls here. So those are some interesting things to explore as well. So let's say you're working in SoundGrain and you've got a sound that you like and you want to be able to export this to some DAW that you're working in. Well, that's really simple in SoundGrain. You can just record through this record interface on the right here. So first you're going to choose the file name that you want to record to. I'm just going to call this Granulated Baby #1. Then you choose where you want to save it. Mine's going to save to my desktop. That's fine. And then you can either have the sound already playing, as mine is now, or you can stop it, start recording, and then start the sound. And right now my sound is recording, and what's great is no matter what I do, whatever I change, what parameters I change are going to be included in my recording. So right now I have a really low grain density, but if I increase my density, change my duration, maybe add some randomness to a lot of my other parameters. And maybe even draw a couple other trajectories. And so then whenever I'm ready for my recording to end, I just hit stop recording. And then I can stop my playback. Now what's really important is you always want to stop the recording before you stop the playback. If you stop the playback first, the recording doesn't close, and it can make it difficult for some programs to read it. Fortunately, Audacity, I've found, will always read your SoundGrain recordings, even if you accidentally stop the playback before you stop the recording. But a lot of other programs won't be able to. So worst comes to worst, if you make that mistake, open the sound recording in Audacity and then re-export it, and you'll still have it. But anyway, so here's my Granulated Baby sound on my desktop. I can open that in Audacity, and you can see that over time I start with something with relatively low density. And then towards the end, I've got that really rich sound. So everything that I changed as all those parameters that I changed, all that was imprinted onto my recording. So that's all I wanted to show you guys in SoundGrain. It's a really useful tool and super easy to export from and include these sounds in other projects you're working on. I just worked on a film scoring project that I used SoundGrain in to a really great extent, and it was super useful for me. All right, so let's now talk about how to do granular synthesis in VCV Rack. And we're going to do so by talking about Mutable Instruments Clouds module. Now, we've talked about a few different modules by this company indirectly in the past. Mutable Instruments is a really popular French manufacturer of Eurorack modules. They actually do mostly digital modules and only a few that are purely analog. But either way, they make all the programming behind their modules open source, which is pretty cool. They tend to have this really simple, elegant appearance, but that often belies that there's tons of functions with each module and that there's lots of different features you can dive behind. So some of these modules, even though if they only might have 5 or 6 knobs, actually have tons and tons of different functions. So in VCV Rack, we use Mutable Instruments hardware clones, which are available from a manufacturer called Audible Instruments. And I'm not exactly sure the relationship between Mutable and Audible, if they're the same company or not. It does seem that in Audible Instruments, they don't use the official brand name of all these hardware modules. So for instance, for the modules we've used, utilities in its hardware form is called kinks. The Bernoulli gate in its hardware form is called branches. And today we're going to be looking at clouds, which in VCB Rack is just called the texture synthesizer. And this is a real-time granular audio processor. So I've got a patch here, which let's go ahead and get this playing, and we'll talk about what's happening here. So on the far left here, I've got a clock module, which is generating a 120 BPM clock, and I'm using the ×2 speed, so the eighth note's coming out of this first output. This is running a simple sequencer, which has 8 steps, and that CB voltage is leaving, going through a VCA, and then this we haven't talked about before, but this is just a simple quantizer. So you can see I've selected which notes I want to quantize to. I like this quantizer because it's got 4 different input outputs, and it also has different scenes you can select. So I can have a second scene where I've got, like, say, just a major scale, and then jump back to a different scene where I've got something more like a minor chord. So then the signal from this quantizer goes into this even VCO oscillator, and then I'm sending the triangle wave through clouds here, and then that signal is going to my mixer. So as I said, Clouds performs real-time granulation. It's actually got 4 different modes, and if you right-click, there's a few different options we can choose between, and I'm looking here in the middle at alternative mode. So there's granular, there's also pitch shifter, etc. We're only going to stick with the granular mode today, and I'll let you guys explore the others on your own. So the way that this works, you might ask yourself, like, okay, well, we've been doing granular synthesis where we've had a recorded sound file and we can move all through that recorded sound file, but how would we do this in real time? We don't actually have a recording that we're moving through. We're trying to do this with actual just voltage that's passing through this in the moment. Well, the way that we do this is that Clouds keeps an ongoing recorded buffer. It's basically constantly recording the past few seconds of audio and then erasing. That buffer just kind of drags behind it. So at any given moment, Clouds always has a buffer of the last few seconds being recorded. And this is important because we can actually change the length of that buffer, but Clouds doesn't have a lot of memory to work with, so however long that buffer is, the longer we want it, the lower the quality of the recording is going to be. So if we right-click, at the bottom there's a set of quality options. So we can do 1 second at a sample rate of 32 kilohertz and 16 bits and stereo. We can have twice as long 2-second buffer if we do that with a mono signal. Then we could have 4 seconds if we do 8-bit, so then it's going to be a little bit degraded. It's going to have a little bit of a bit crushed quality to it. And then if we want that to be mono, we can get as many as 8 seconds. So I'm going to choose the 2-second one, and I'm going to explain why. And before I do that, I'll also point out that you can see some visual representations of this at the top here. So there's like a nice smooth stereo signal, which is our highest quality, a smooth mono signal, a kind of bit crushed stereo, and then a bit crushed mono. And these are up here. You can't actually choose between them here. You have to use the right-click menu, but on the hardware module, you can actually use these to show you which one you're changing to. So as I said, I chose the 2-second recording, and the reason for that has to do with the speed of my sequencer here. So my clock module is sending 120 BPM. This sequence has 8 steps. If there are 8 steps and each one is happening at 120 BPM, that means every 2 steps will take a second, because 60 BPM would be 1 step per second. We're doing twice that. So that would be 2 steps for every second, so 8 steps would be a total of 4 seconds. But I'm using the ×2 clock, so I'm actually going twice as fast as that. So my whole sequence here only takes 2 seconds. So it makes sense then. I'm going to choose a 2-second buffer, and so at any given moment, I'm going to have my whole sequence recorded into my buffer. The other reason I chose the mono signal, the mono 2 seconds, is because I'm just sending a mono signal in, so I don't actually need to worry about stereo. Okay, so the first knob that we're going to look at here is the blend knob in the bottom right, and this is literally just a dry-wet mixer. So if it's all the way to the left, we just hear the dry signal. If it's all the way to the right, we're just going to hear the wet signal. So I'm going to leave it there, and you notice obviously we're not hearing anything right now, and that's because we have to start changing some options here. So the first one we'll look at is density, and this is exactly what you would think. It's the density of our grains. And the way this knob works is as we move to the left, we're going to start getting the grains in synchronous spacing, synchronous rhythm. So as I start moving this to the left, you can hear these grains coming at a regular rate. And the farther we go, the more often they happen, and they eventually start to overlap. And if we go all the way to the left, we get something that just sounds like our smooth signal, but it actually is being granulated. It's just all these grains are overlapping. If we move to the right, we'll hear the same thing, except it's going to be asynchronous. So we'll hear these rhythms in a little more random, disjunct fashion. And if we increase that knob to the right, they'll eventually happen more and more often, start to overlap. And again, all the way over, we'll just get a pretty smooth signal that sounds like our incoming signal. So let's go ahead and do a little bit of synchronous grains. Then up here, the size, this is the duration of the grain. So we can make our grains shorter and shorter. Or longer and longer and longer. Let's go ahead and do something like this. And then this texture knob has to do with the grain envelope. So if it's right here in the middle, it's doing a nice Hahn window. And then if we move it to slowly to the left, we start to get something more like a triangle wave. And then all the way to the right, we get what they call boxcar, which is basically just like a square. You'll hear those clicks on either side of the grain. And then, if we move to the right, around 2 or 3 o'clock, we start to get some diffusion, which is going to actually smear the attack transients. And almost sounds like a reverb. It's like the very opposite of the boxcar. The boxcar, we get these really hard attacks, and with the diffusion, we get these really blurred attacks. So let's go back to the Hahn for now. This knob on the bottom left just controls the input level. So here, these lights up here show the input level coming in. And just like when you're doing audio recording, you want to get a good strong level, but you don't want it to be moving into the clipping area. Except that Clouds actually has some nice soft clipping features. So there might be some instances where you do want to crank it up and go into the red and get a little bit of that clipping. It looks like my signal right now isn't strong enough to go all the way into the red and get that clipping, but I could always just throw a VCA here and bring that signal up a little bit if I wanted to get some of that soft clipping. But for now, I'm just going to go back to this moderately strong signal. And then this position knob changes our position in the recording buffer. So as I said, Clouds is constantly recording a buffer of, in our case, the past 2 seconds of audio. And this position knob will change where it's pulling grains from that buffer. So depending on where we move this can actually start to function like a delay, where if we hear the dry signal and the wet signal together, we'll increase our density. We can actually hear the signal that's getting delayed. And as we move this, we can move backwards and forwards in that buffer and effectively change the delay time. It's like we're moving backwards and forwards in time. We just hear only the wet. We're just kind of jumping around in this buffer. Doesn't quite have the same effect if it's just wet, but we'll look at some instances later where it does make a big difference. And then over here, I think this is the last knob. This is the pitch knob, and this does exactly what you think. It works basically just like the pitch knob on an oscillator. So we can change the pitch of these grains. And you'll notice that there's a volts per octave input down here, and this works with the pitch knob, so we can actually tune all the sounds coming into clouds. And so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to set up another sequencer and another VCA. We're going to send this into our quantizer, use the same quantizer, and then we'll send this into our volts per octave. And then let's go ahead and take a slow clock here that's divided by 8 clock, and we'll use that to run this sequencer. And so you can hear that we're kind of tuning things as we go based on the pitches of this slow clock. Let's go ahead and get a different pattern here than we have on the top one. All right, so we'll come back to that later, but I just wanted you guys to hear how that kind of works. Okay, so this blend knob is kind of special. You notice it has this little dot next to it to tell us that there's something interesting going on with it. And if we go up to this button at the top here, there's actually 4 different modes, and the blend knob changes color with each mode. And you can see some visual representation of what each of these 4 modes does with these symbols up here. So the first one is the dry wet blend, which we've already talked about, and this has a little drop for wetness, I guess, to represent that. The second one is the stereo spread, and this is represented by 2 a left and right kind of wedge. And so if we increase this, we're increasing the random stereo spread, just like we did in SoundGrain. So I'll go ahead and crank that all the way up. Why not? The third one, you see this little arrow looping around. This is feedback level. And so the way this works, it's just like if we took one of the outputs, ran it through a VCA, and then sent it back into the one of the inputs. This is just controls the volume of the level that's being fed back in. So we can actually take the granulated sound and send it back into the granulator just using this knob, and that'll make the sound even more grainy because we're adding some of the granulated sound to the buffer. And then the last mode, you see this little 3D cube, that represents a space because this last mode is a reverb mode. And if we increase this, we're just adding some reverb to our sound. And it's actually a really nice reverb. You can turn the density all the way over, so we just get the raw sound and just get a nice reverb. But we'll go back to granulation because that's what we're here for. And the last thing that we've yet to talk about is this freeze button. And what this freeze button does is it freezes the buffer. It stops the recording and just keeps whatever the last couple seconds were in the buffer, depending on how long your buffer is. So our buffer is just 2 seconds, so if we hit this freeze button, it's just going to lock the last 2 seconds into the buffer. So let's go ahead and hit that. And so we're not recording any longer. We can just full on get rid of our input. And we're just working with whatever's been recorded into the buffer here. And then we can change some features here of the buffer. We can change its pitch. The size of the grains. And of course the position. And you can hear as I move this position knob around, we actually move through our whole buffer. We can actually try to So we can actually kind of try to drive this and get something that's not exactly the same, because what would be the point, but similar to what was happening before. So I'm going to take an LFO and a VCA, and I'm going to run my sawtooth wave through this VCA to try to drive my position forward. Let's go ahead and move this down. Let's make this a little slower. And I've noticed in playing around with this that the position knob doesn't seem to like really high voltages. So if I scale this down, we actually are getting something that sounds like we're moving through our buffer. So it sounds kind of similar to the pattern. We can almost hear that melody kind of emerging through that cloud. And, well, if we can move through in order with a sawtooth, where we're just sort of scaling up this sawtooth as we move to the high voltage, we are moving through the position, and then we jump back down when the sawtooth jumps down. Let's go ahead and use a random voltage to just kind of jump around. So instead of the sawtooth wave, let's send a random voltage out. And then we'll go ahead and just use the full-on random steps. And if we increase our rate, you can hear that we're just jumping all around randomly through that buffer. And we're getting a sound like in SoundGrain when we had it on random position. It's just randomly jumping through all around in that buffer and giving us random grains from our whole 2-second buffer. One other thing I'll point out to you about freeze mode is we're not feeding back anymore because we don't have a constantly moving buffer, so we're not constantly recording. So we can't actually send our output back into our input in the same way. So this feedback knob actually works a little differently in freeze mode. It just kind of adds another kind of layer of reverbiness. Kind of makes those clouds even more diffused. We can also just control any of these other parameters with CV inputs. So I'm going to go ahead and just take another random voltage and send that to, let's say, the texture. So now it's jumping all around, including to the square wave boxcar mode, and that's giving us some little staticky pops. And now let's go ahead and drive our pitch again. So I'm going to take our slow sequence, and we'll go ahead and take our volts per octave input again and send that into the pitch. And so now every 8 steps of our clock, we're getting a new pitch level. So this is a really nice texture. What we can do to maybe finish this off is add a bass line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this slow sequence that I've got going that's driving the pitch of my granulation. I'm going to send that same sequence into my oscillator here by just moving this output down to the one that's moving from my slow sequence. And then instead of sending my oscillator into the granulator, I'm just going to send that directly into the mixer. And let's make this a bass line. And so now the same pitches that are driving the pitch of my granulator are also providing a nice bass line. And if I wanted to get more involved, I could probably give an envelope to this bass line, which would make it sound a little better, maybe run it through a reverb or something, but you guys get the idea. So take some time to explore clouds. It's really useful, and you can get a better sense of how granulation works by working with it both in SoundGrain and with clouds. You get a few different views of how we can use granular synthesis. So I'm going to include a link to a YouTube video in the lesson of a modular synth artist named R. Benny, who works a lot with clouds with the texture synthesizer. And so you can listen to and see how they use it in their work. So that'll be on Blackboard as well. All right, so we're going to wrap up here. Today we talked about granular synthesis. We went over the definition of what granular synthesis is. We talked about the history and looked at, for instance, some of Xenakis's approach to using it, and we looked at some different parameters like the envelope and the timing and things like that. Then we looked at how to do granular synthesis in SoundGrain and in VCV Rack with Mutable Instruments Clouds module, or Audible Instruments texture synthesizer, I should say. So next time we'll talk about additive synthesis and FM synthesis, and I'll talk to you guys then.